Good evening, Kalispera. Very nice to see you all. A warm welcome to the unfortunately last lecture of this year at least. I will not be saying Merry Christmas yet, that is too premature, but I am very happy to introduce our guest of today, our lecture of today, presented by Dr. Vassilis Evangelidis, who is a research associate at the Athena Research Center Exanti. He specializes in classical and digital archaeology. He has received two MA theses, or one MA and one MSc thesis. The first MA received in 1998 in archaeology from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki.
I'm sold.
And you're sold?
I am so old.
Oh, you're so old. Oh, no. You're just ripe as good wine. No. And then 3 years later, in 2001, he received also, additionally, an MSc in archaeological computing from the University of Southampton in the UK, where he studied as a Lambrakis Foundation scholar. His very general research focuses on the urbanism, architecture, material culture of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, with a particular emphasis on the built environment, fortifications, and the relationship between landscape, economy, and identity in ancient Greece. He is also active in the field of digital archaeology, applying 3D modeling, GIS analyses, and computational methods such as biological and neural network modeling to archaeological research. Vassilis Evangelidis is the author of two books, two monographs, the first being The Agora of the Cities of Greece from the Roman Conquest to the 3rd century AD, published in 2010 by the University Studio Press. And then more recently, The Archaeology of Roman Macedonia, Urban and Rural Environments, published in 2022 by Oxbow Books. And this gives me also the ample opportunity to plug his forthcoming book, if I'm not mistaken, to be published by Bloomsbury Academics, and where he explores the archaeology of Aegean Thrace, focusing on settlement dynamics, networks, and cultural interactions in that very specific region. He's also a well-known member, a well-known co-organizer of the renowned Roman Seminar here in Athens since 2012. Well, I don't have to go into the details of the Roman Seminar, but it is a long-standing collaborative initiative promoting research and public engagement with the Roman past of Greece. And he is also the founder of an Aegis laboratory in Xanthi, dedicated to the archaeological research of GIS and its innovation. I have also personally had the great pleasure of collaborating with Vassilis this summer in the Kephissos Valley project of the German Archaeological Institute. And so I can only give a very warm thanks to that very fruitful collaboration. And this can also just serve as a great introduction into a fascinating field, which he will be talking to us about today, a field that he enabled, at least for today's talk, as extending the potential of landscape archaeology from GIS to ABM, so agent-based modeling. And without further ado, Vassilis, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we're very happy to be having you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, I'm not touching the microphones. Well, Yannis was explicit in that. Well, thank you for the introduction. So I want to thank also Tina and the Belgian School for the introduction, for the invitation. Of course, the Dipylon Society, the Belgian School, the Netherlands Institute, the German Institute for hosting the Atlas lecture, which is a great initiative. I have also to thank my institute because they paid my expenses, the Archimedes and Datapod, to come here, which I should not forget. I'm really grateful. So, and thank you all for doing me the honors and coming today. So, today, what I would like to share with you is a journey, let's say, but not just a journey through landscapes of the ancient world, but also a journey through methodological change. Over the last few years, my research and that of my colleagues, which is Hayri Kurt back in Xanthi, which is an IT and AI and robotics specialist, and of course my friend Dimitris Grigoropoulos, has gradually moved from GIS-based spatial analysis to agent-based modeling. And this transition has been motivated by a single and persistent question. How did people in the ancient world move through, experience, and make sense of their landscapes? So movement, okay, it works. Movement in many ways lies at the very heart of human life. It connects people, it connects places, it connects ideas. It's through movement that trade happens, that rituals unfold, that empires expand, and that communities interact with their environment. When I began my work, or our work, in landscape archaeology, or in the archaeology of landscapes, probably, GIS offer a powerful way to map and analyze these connections. It allowed us to quantify distances, to see visibility, accessibility, to measure space in new ways. But very soon, I realized that something was missing. These models, as sophisticated as they were, often fail to capture the human element, the lived, the embodied experience of moving through a landscape. They could show us the shortest path, but not the most meaningful one. They could map routes, but not decisions, hesitation, or social interactions. And that realization, that gap, let's say, between precision and human experience became the starting point for this project. So today, what I'd like to do is to take you through this shift from GIS to agent-based modeling, from static spatial analysis to more dynamic simulation, and show how combining these tools can help us better understand movement, perception, and interaction to the ancient world. So GIS brought what we might call a quiet revolution in the way we understand landscapes, and therefore in the way we understand archaeology itself. And we'll mention that this Master of Science I did back in 2000 in Southampton, which was one of the major research centers in GIS back then, and nobody knew what is GIS. And all this English, UK-based archaeology did great things in promote the use of GIS in archaeology. So at its core, GIS, the Geographic Information Systems, is a tool for capturing, managing, analyzing, and visualizing spatial data. But in archaeology, it becomes much more than that. It allows us to map sites, to map monuments and features across an entire landscape, and to explore how they relate to one another. It's one thing to excavate a fort or a settlement in isolation, and it's another thing to understand it, to see it in its broader landscape. So GIS let us step back and see the bigger picture, how sites were connected, how they interacted with their environment, and how people might have moved through the landscape that connected them. One of the major advancements, and I have to say that all the pictures you will see is from projects we did in the GIS Athena Center. This one is from a new project we do. We try to explore the movement from Maronia to the famous site in the interior of Thrace, Vetren, or Pistyros, as some people believe. So this is a least cost path analysis that leads from the coast of Aegean Thrace to the interior. So one of the major advancements that GIS brought to our understanding is, of course, the ability to model movement and accessibility. By creating what we call coast surfaces, we can estimate the effort required to move across different kinds of terrain. For instance, moving uphill is more demanding than walking on flat ground, and river or marshes can slow or redirect travel. Using this data, GIS can calculate least cost paths between locations, essentially giving us models of the most efficient or likely routes people may have taken in the past. And when you see these routes appear across a landscape, you start to understand that movement not as a random wandering, but as a set of choices shaped by environment, effort, and purpose. GIS has also been crucial in helping us explore the perception of landscapes. Through methods like viewshed analysis, and you see here another project we're doing, we can estimate what could be seen from a particular point, in this case, a fort in the lowlands, in the foothill of Rhodope, for example, from a hill fort like here, a temple or a watchtower. This is, however, more than a technical curiosity. Visibility influenced how settlements were placed, how defensive systems were organized, and even how travelers navigated across open terrain. In this way, GIS helped us not only map where people lived, but also how they saw and understood their surroundings. Another major contribution of GIS is, of course, in revealing networks and connectivity. And you see here some of the work I'm doing with Dimitris. Instead of thinking about isolated sites, we can now think in terms of systems of settlements, systems of resources and routes. By applying GIS network analysis, and here are some of the students I had last year in the digital humanities, and they know what I'm talking about. By applying this kind of GIS network analysis, we can identify central hubs, peripheral settlements, and the corridors that link them. This kind of analysis reveals patterns of trade, patterns of communication, and movement that would otherwise remain invisible. For example, by mapping settlement networks, we can identify key trade centers or strategic nodes that save the flow of goods and people, places that may not always be the largest or the richest, but that were crucial because of their connectivity. And you see here how with Dimitris we try to reconstruct the network of imports of Roman pottery around the famous sanctuary of Kalapodi that the German Institute excavates. So GIS has given us the tools to think spatially, to move beyond isolated finds and reconstruct the web of relationships that structure ancient life. It allows us to connect the dots between topography, infrastructure, and human behavior. But as powerful as GIS is, it also has its limitations. And that's where my or our research began to look beyond traditional spatial analysis. Because mapping movement is one thing, understanding how it was experienced is another. So it is important to recognize that GIS has this limitation, especially when we try to understand lived human experiences in the past. Scholars like Marcos Llobera and Giacomo Landeschi, both of them pioneers of GIS archaeology, have argued that traditional spatial models, for all their analytical precision, often oversimplify historical landscapes. They give us beautiful, data-rich maps, but they sometimes fail to capture what it actually felt like to move through those landscapes, to walk, to climb, to see, to experience space as a human being. So, as Maurizio Forte, another great name, a pioneer of digital archaeology, pointed out back in 2003, understanding how people interacted with their environment requires much more than just cartographic precision. It requires approaches that bring in phenomenology, that is, the study of experience, and that consider the multisensory ways in which ancient people perceived their surroundings. Because when we think about it, past landscapes were not just coordinates or topographical surfaces, they were lived landscapes. They were full of sound, smell, movement, and meaning. So, one of the key challenges in archaeological GIS, I believe, is its tendency to treat the past as a static, as a set of fixed points and lines on a map, but people, of course, were not static. They moved, they made choices, they interpreted space through culture, belief, and necessity. Stuart Eve, in 2012, suggested that in order to really understand ancient landscapes, we have to move beyond static maps and create immersive, dynamic environments that reflect the complexity and meaning of past experience. That means not just mapping where people went, but also how and why they moved and what those movements might have meant to them. And this brings us to a key question. Why it's so important for archaeology to study movement and not just location? Because movement is at the heart of how humans interact with their environment. Through movement, people connect places, they exchange goods, they share ideas, and they build communities. Studying movement allows us to bridge the gap between individual experience and social structure, between the paths people walked and the networks that shaped entire regions. In short, movement helps us see the landscape as a process, not as a backdrop. It becomes a stage of human action, constantly negotiated and constantly redefined. So, the limitations of GIS, its inability to fully capture the embodied, subjective, and emotional dimension of human life, have pushed us to look for new ways to explore ancient movement. And we began to ask, how can we bring the human experience back into the map? How can we combine data precision with experiential depth? And that's where the integration of GIS with 3D technologies and simulation environments, especially game engines, begins to open up exciting new possibilities. Having recognized the limits of traditional GIS in capturing human experience, the next step was to explore how we could move beyond these kind of static maps. A promising solution comes from integrating GIS data with game engines such as Unity 3D and Unreal Engine, some of the many that exist. Okay, these open access platforms are often associated with video games, but they are increasingly used in archaeology because they allow us to build dynamic, interactive landscapes. Instead of simply looking at a map or a static 3D reconstruction, we can now walk through the terrain, we can explore different paths and experience spatial relationships in a way that mirrors human perception. What makes this approach powerful is that it combines analytical precision with experiential depth. Unlike costly photorealistic reconstructions done by specialists that you have to pay a lot of money, these cheap solutions, these game engines, are flexible and accessible, letting us create realistic terrains using GIS-derived data. They enable real-time navigation, so we can simulate how people move through landscapes. They allow us to incorporate interactivity. We can change scenarios, we can adjust obstacles, we can observe how agents or users respond to the environment. In short, game engines can help us bridge the gap between data-driven research, which is the GIS, and embodied experience. One of the key concepts here is, of course, presence, the sense that you're actually inside the landscape rather than simply looking at a representation of it. By accurately placing monuments, settlements, roads, whatever you can imagine, within the terrain, these models can give us a stronger sense of authenticity. We can introduce interactive elements so that users or, let's say, simulated agents can explore choices, perceive obstacles, and experience the consequences of movement decisions. In other words, this approach doesn't just let us see the landscape, it lets us experience as past people might have experienced it. And another important point I want to stress out is, of course, accessibility. With basic technical skills, I myself have basic technical skills. I don't have some sort of super knowledge in using Unity. Archaeologists can now integrate GIS data into game engines. They can create interactive reconstructions. They can test hypotheses without needing a dedicated technical and expensive technical team. This, in my point of view, democratizes digital archaeology, putting the interpretation and the exploration of data back into the hands of the researchers rather than leaving it to programmers or just designers. In my own research, I combine, which is basically Roman archaeology, as Will said at the beginning. In my own research, I combine GIS techniques with Unity 3D to explore the landscapes of rural Roman Thrace. I focused on the relationship between imperial infrastructure, like Via Egnatia, and local elements, such as mountain forts that they exist all over Thrace, and roadside tumuli. By integrating GIS-based spatial analysis with a 3D interactive environment, I could simulate how travelers, locals, and even invaders might have navigated the landscape. This approach allowed me to examine both the strategic and economic significance of sites, as well as sensory and cognitive experiences, how people saw, how people felt, and how people responded to their surroundings. What is particularly valuable about combining GIS with game engine is that it helps us overcome this, let's say, deterministic aspect of traditional GIS. GIS, as I said at the beginning, can tell us the shortest path or the most efficient route, but it assumes a rational, uniform behavior. By adding interactivity and simulation, but it's inherent in this kind of game engines, we can test multiple scenarios, we can explore different movement strategies, and account for human variability, age, physical ability, group size, or even social behavior. This, I think, and I have actually written an article about it, opens the door to a much richer, more nuanced understanding of movement in ancient landscapes. And in this video, which I will try to make it play, you see here, done very roughly in Unity 3D. This is an actual tumulus outside where our research center lies in Xanthi. And I wanted to examine I used just the basic shapes, so it's not some sort of fancy 3D reconstruction. How people on top of the tumulus could have experienced the landscape around them, and visual perception, in this case, I think with other tumuli and with forts on the top, played a very important role. So we have seen how GIS and game engines allow us to map and explore landscapes interactively. But what if we want to simulate movement and decision making for multiple people or groups at the same time? This is where agent-based modeling, or ABM, comes into play. And this is actually a notion that our colleague Heidi Kurt put into the group. ABM is a computational method, and that lets us create virtual environments populated with autonomous agents, each representing an individual or a group that move, that make decisions, that interact according to defined behavioral rules. In other words, instead of just visualizing the terrain, as I did here, we can now simulate human behavior within it. Each agent in an ABM is programmed with simple rules: how fast they can move, how they respond to obstacles, how they interact with other agents, how they make choices based on goals or environment. When multiple agents act at the same time, complex patterns emerge naturally, patterns that often are invisible in the archaeological record. And you see here, hopefully, this is actually, it's not my project, it's the project of our Athena Research Center by Heidi Kurt. They did it for the Museum of Patras, where they trained agents as ancient Greek hoplites. They trained them in battle techniques. They used millions of these agents. They needed a lot of computational power in order to make a scenario where different groups of hoplites were fighting each other. So you can understand the potentials of this kind of stuff. So having this in mind, ABM can simulate crowd movement through a settlement, can simulate pilgrimage routes in a sanctuary, can simulate fleeing villagers, as I will show you later, and pursuing forces during conflict, can actually simulate trade and communication networks across a region. So it is really open to exploration or different scenarios, depends on the researcher and its research question. The real power comes also when we combine ABM with GIS-derived data. Terrain, roads, rivers, and obstacles from GIS shape the world in which the agents move. Agent behavior allows us to explore how people might have navigated, avoided, or used this feature. So this integration let us study both individual experiences, how a single traveler perceives a hill or a river, and large-scale patterns, how whole groups might have moved, interacted, or responded to events in the landscape. And everything starts from a solid philosophical and mathematical base, the famous Ortoni-Clore-Collins model, a model that actually was developed, and you see here the book, which is it's actually a book that's actually readable. It's a philosophical book. Okay, it's not this kind of strange IT stuff. The cognitive structure of emotions, which basically was used in order the programmers, the researchers, to find ways to simulate human-like decision in gaming. Okay, so why is ABM valuable for archaeologists? Why I think it's valuable? Because it allows us to move beyond deterministic models that assume everyone moves the same way, because it lets us simulate multiple groups with different physical abilities, goals, or strategies, because it produces emergent patterns, showing us how individual decision can lead to collective behavior. And yes, I had another one, because it opens the door to testing scenarios, as I did with Dimitris, such as defense strategies, trade flows, or migration routes in ways that static maps or first-person exploration cannot. Now, in the next part of the lecture, I will present two case studies where this combination of methods, from GIS to game engines and ABM, and even the use of AI, has been applied to explore movement across ancient landscapes. This is where theory, technology, and archaeological interpretation come together, in my view, creating a dynamic way to explore past landscapes. The two case studies we will present, the one is the Chimeria Fort, which is just outside our research center, and which I personally have, I have a research interest in that, and the Kalapodi Sanctuary, where with Dimitris we have developed this project of trade flows and the rest. I want to stress out that these simulations that you will see are not definitive answers. They are starting points, providing new insights and generating questions that help us understand the multiple factors shaping movement in antiquity. So let's start with our first case, which is the Chimeria Fort. This is a Roman period, probably even older, dry stone fort located at the foot of the Rhodope Mountains, near modern Xanthi, the fort of Chimeria. Perched roughly 500 meters above sea level, you see here the picture I took with a lot of copo, how can I say that in English? I forgot it. The fort overlooks the Hellenistic Roman settlement at the mountain's base. And you can see here in the map, which is the project I did for my book, to map all the sites, settlements in Roman Aegean Thrace, with the red dots. There are similar other forts there in the area. It's one of the most persistent archaeological features of the Aegean Thrace. Okay, so the exact function of this kind of forts, which basically are classes, they are known as the Thracian forts. This is how they are known in bibliography. They remain uncertain. Was it built in order to supervise, the Via Egnatia to the south? Was it built in order to control movement along mountain routes connecting Thrace to the coast? And this is actually a project that we're running now in Athena Research Center, Thrace Connect, a project that I want to explore geospatially the area of the Rhodope Mountains to see how they were connecting the coast to the interior, or did it serve as a refuge for local population during times of unrest? What is clear is that these forts had a close relationship with the settlements below, balancing accessibility and remoteness. Understanding the relationship, this relationship, is key to interpret their role in the landscapes. So, to begin, we applied all the traditional GIS techniques. We did view-set analysis, which calculates the areas visible from the specific point, in this case, the castle, so that the fort's line of sight covered both the mountain roads leading from the interior of Thrace, historically a corridor for invading armies and migrating groups. Don't forget that the major invading force in Roman Greece, the Kostoboki, probably came down these routes. Okay, and of course covering the plain where the Via Egnatia passed. Okay. This pattern suggested that the fort may have had a dual purpose, monitoring local routes while also keeping an eye on imperial infrastructure. Such a role would require rapid response capabilities for the garrison or the controlling group. We also applied, of course, the famous R-walk analysis algorithm. We did it in QGIS, and I show you here in ArcGIS Pro, which models ease of movement across terrain by factoring in slope and landscape friction. The results indicate that the fort, and you see it's the interior circle, the yellow one, was between 2 to 5 hours travel from the lowlands, and I know that because I did it, and I did the 5 hours, I didn't do the 2 hours, or maybe 6 hours, I don't remember, suggesting it could actually function as a refuge, or perhaps even as a ritual site, given the evidence of cult activity, such as the famous hero rider cult that existed in the region. So, while these analyses are illuminating, and they help me to write the book and to do my research and so on, they remain somewhat monodimensional. They focus mainly on visibility and accessibility. So the next step, and I have to thank my friend Hairi for that, was to move further. And I will do a parenthesis here. You know that the main purpose of the research centers, and such the research center I'm working at, is that actually brings together people from different specialities. So when, in the breaks and having lunch or whatever, I analyze my problem that, I want to use this, but I don't know, and this and that. the guy comes and says, well, there is agent-based modeling, you can do it in Unity. So actually, this is the benefit of interdisciplinarity. Okay, so the next step was to move further to apply agent-based modeling on the reconstructed terrain in order to simulate complex movement patterns, especially involving different groups moving at the same time. So we asked questions like, what would have happened if the villagers at the foot of the mountain tried to escape an invading army moving along Via Egnatia? Would they have had enough time to reach the fort? Would the invaders follow them? Or would the terrain favor the refugees? How would crowd dynamics, terrain, and possibly visibility interact to save the outcome? So we start building the project more like a gameplay, more like, in our free time, not like a normal project. We built the project on previous GIS study I did of settlement patterns in Thrace, which provided the digital elevation model and the settlement locations. We created a digital elevation model-based terrain of 20 times 12 kilometers, accurately representing slopes, valleys, and obstacles. And it's 20 times 12 kilometers because we didn't have the computational power to do something bigger. We had only the computers in the office. Okay. And I will explain what we did later in Kalapodi. To simulate movement, we generated a nav mesh, a navigation mesh, guiding agents across the terrain, which is this blue stuff you see on the picture. We applied a 15% slope limit to reflect the physical capabilities and the familiarity of the local lowland population. Steeper slopes, more than 50%, could, of course, slow travel, while moderate slopes could be negotiated more efficiently. So this setup, which came after a lot of discussion and after reading the appropriate bibliography and discussing with local people and people who have walked and the mountaineering club in Xanthi, this setup allowed us to analyze travel times, accessibility, and response dynamics in a realistic way. We then divided the population into 4 agent groups, each with specific movement dynamics based on real-world research and body mechanics and terrain navigation, and all these crazy maths done by Hairi. I mean, the moment I saw them, it was just, but he sat down and he calculated, based on bibliography, I have to stress that, the different movement of each of these groups. And you see, for instance, the hostiles, the invading army, they can move with 5.1 kilometers per hour, while the elderly families with 2.8, and the old people like myself with 1.8 kilometers. That's why we took 8 hours to go up the mountain. Okay, so we divided it in 4 groups: the fit adults with fastest move, the elderly individuals with slower and more difficult on slopes, with mothers with children or families with moderate speed and safer path preferences, and of course the hostile forces, more aggressive, more taking direct routes. To determine the most realistic routes, we implemented the famous for them, because Hairi told me that you have to say the famous A-star search algorithm, which briefly, the A-star finds the optimal path by balancing the cost of traversing terrain with an estimate of distance to the destination. It's something like the least cost path we do in GIS. It ensures that agents take the most efficient, walkable paths while respecting terrain obstacles. Movement was adjusted for slope, always in Unity, okay, producing a realistic simulation of each group's ability to reach the fort. Time metrics were scaled for clarity, because I couldn't show you a video with 8 hours people climbing the mountain. And this led us to compare speed and accessibility across all groups. And because I know that somebody will ask, here we use the A-star algorithm to calculate optimal paths across the terrain. A-star, it's deterministic. It's like the least cost path analysis in GIS, meaning that the same inputs always produce the same paths. But in our ABM simulation, agents are not identical. They differ in speed, they differ in group type, they differ even in behavioral rules. As a result, even with deterministic paths, the interaction between agents combined with terrain constraints produce dynamic and realistic patterns of movement. In other words, A-star gives us a foundation of realistic paths, while ABM adds the human variability and complexity that GIS alone or A* cannot capture. And the simulation, which is done very roughly, as you see, but forget the dots and the stuff, it's a real simulation of people moving across the terrain, produce some very interesting insights. I don't have the whole video, okay? But different groups, of course, reach the fort at varying times, and you see here how the groups were divided, following paths consistent with archaeologically documented roads. I mean, the paths they followed, we know that there are actually roads there, okay? The more vulnerable groups, such as women with children, arrive last, even after the elderly people, highlighting the challenges faced by slower or encumbered travelers. The enemy agents, which hopefully you'll see soon, initially pursuing we missed it, but one moment, I can go back a little bit. If I manage to do it, okay. Okay, here you see that the enemy agents initially, and you see how they track the villagers, pursuing the fleeing villagers, at a point stopped at the highlands or at the beginning of the highlands, suggesting that the ascent was too resource intensive to continue pursuit. So the agents there took a decision that it doesn't deserve the trouble to follow the villagers. And this actually, as a Roman archaeologist, tells me something. It tells me that the fort's strategic location provided actually an effective refuge, as the attackers would be discouraged by difficult terrain and, of course, by the danger of an ambush. So the real power of this method, I think, is that it allows us to explore dynamic, multi-agent scenarios impossible to observe from the archaeological record alone. So we can simulate individual and group movements. We can simulate interaction between multiple actors. We can test alternative historical scenarios, such as attacks, escapes, or pilgrimages. And we can actually try that because one of the theories of this fort is that it was actually, a ritual site for the hero rider cult. And we know that the Thracians were going uphill as a pilgrimage to the hero rider. So we can check that. We can check how long it took them to do that, and so on. So, in my opinion, this opens new avenues for research and allow us to test hypotheses about strategy, about accessibility, and about human behavior with ancient landscapes. What this case study showed me is that combining GIS, game engines, and ABM, and you see here a video I did in ArcGIS Pro, the colors you see are all the accessible slopes that someone can walk to go up to the fort. It's just the abilities of ArcGIS Pro in simulation is unbelievable. But so what this case showed us is that combining GIS, game engine, and ABM let us move from static maps to dynamic simulations. It allowed us to explore not just where people moved, but how they moved, why they moved, and how groups interacted with each other and the landscape. In other words, it can bring us closer to understand movement as a lived experience and socially mediated phenomenon. And this takes us to the second case, the case of Kalapodi, where we refined a little bit our models, and we're not just the dots you see there. So, shifting from the first case on Chimeria, we turn to Kalapodi, a sanctuary in central Greece, excavated by the German Archaeological Institute since 1973, 50 years now. Excavations that reveal multiple phases of use, showing the sanctuary's evolving role over time. Over the past 2 or 3 years now, Dimitris Grigoropoulos and myself have combined social network analysis and GIS to examine Kalapodi's connectivity and accessibility during the Roman period, particularly in relation to the import of Roman pottery. Very sorry about that. Social network analysis allowed us to map site connectivity based on shared ceramics, while GIS allowed us to reconstruct routes and travel distances, revealing Kalapodi's active participation in a regional trade network. Kalapodi, therefore, emerged as a central hub for central Greece, embedded in the economic and social practices of the Roman world. But as in the previous case, this approach raised further questions. How were the goods transported from Italy, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Africa to the sanctuary? What networks and what infrastructure support their movement? While GIS and SNA provided valuable insights into connectivity, which will be published soon, an article we have written with Dimitris, they are limited by their static two-dimensional nature. So we asked, what if we could explore movement in real time, accounting for road conditions, terrain difficulties, and choice of transport method? So by integrating GIS, SNA, and in this case, Unity, we could study not just where goods moved, but how, when, and why. Using the same methodology, and we did that from 3 major harbors in the area, and Dimitris will correct me, from Alopi, from Paleomagaza and Kinos Livanates. He gave me the note, so I know that I'm correct. So using the same methodology as in Chimeria, we created a scaled 1 to 10,000 model in Unity 3D of the area surrounding Kalapodi. We focused on the transportation of amphorae from the harbors using 2 different scenarios based on the transport method. And you see here, this is the original digital elevation model we used in order to build the Unity simulation. These 2 cases, the one is ox-driven carts, and we have evidence from the famous Vindolada tablet 649. Vindolada is a fort in the Hadrian's wall, and this tablet, this wooden tablet from the late 1st century CE, tells us that these small carts like this, could carry up to 350 kilos. And 350 kilos corresponds to 3 to 4 ZEST 80 amphorae or 26 to 27 Capitaine 2 amphorae, both types found in the sanctuary of Kalapodi. And the second scenario we wanted to try is to go with mules and donkeys, which typically carried 90 to 120 kilos at the incredible speed of 5 to 6.5 kilometers per hour, even with 20% reduction in mountainous terrain. And I had the pleasure to take part in excavation back in the 90s in the mountains of Vergina, where Professor Fackler used mules, donkeys to carry the material up to the mountain, and they were incredible. I mean, they just let us in a steady pace. It was unbelievable to see the mules going up the hill. So, a late Roman mosaic from Livadia, who you see here in a very bad picture, it was found by Vassilis Aravandinos and published in 2006, actually depict a mule carrying amphorae similar to those found by Dimitris and Will and the rest of the people from the German Institute at Kalapodi. We accelerated the simulation time by 100 times, and we convert the results back into the real-world travel times. Due to the computational limits, as I said before, the model focuses on this smaller area, but future work can expand coverage. We do have the computer capability in Athena to do that, but we didn't expect that would be so, cumbersome, the whole procedure, because this, as I said, was like a gameplay we did. But now that we are actually starting to set up the methodology, we know what kind of computational power to use. And we did the maths. No, actually, we didn't do the maths. Jairi did the maths. And you see here the calculation for each transport method. You see that the ox-driven cart can actually move with 0.703, and the mules can go with 0.96 meters per second, or 3.45 kilometers per hour. In the first scenario that you see here, and hopefully will run, 3 ox-driven carts, each carrying 350 kilos, the model actually measures that, travel from the harbors of Alopi, Kinos, and Paleomagaza, I have it written, Dimitris, to Kalapodi, and the results highlight the overland transport challenges. And just before, with Angelos, we had a discussion about that, how theoretical we archaeologists, it's our theoretical knowledge of how people moved in antiquity, and we don't know the difficulties of reality. So the cart from Alopi, which basically today is 30 kilometers, and you do it with the car in 15 minutes, took 17 hours to arrive. This, of course, does not include the rest periods for oxen or loading and unloading stops. So what this simulation demonstrated is the limitation of this kind of heavy carts in mountainous terrain, particularly without advanced traction technology or large metal roads. And you saw that the one from Alopi didn't take the mountain roads, but went, it took the road, the flat road that leads today from Atalandi to Kalapodi. In the second scenario, we used mules and donkeys carrying smaller loads. The steady speed of 0.96 meters per second, even on slopes up to 30 degrees, is, of course, amazing. So this means that the load capacity reduced in mountain areas, but travel is more consistent. The results show a substantial reduction in travel time compared to carts, to ox carts, highlighting the efficiency and adaptability of pack animals. While each mule carries fewer amphorae, the overall transport efficiency is higher, allowing more frequent trips and flexibility in navigating difficult terrain. So comparing the two scenarios together, again by Hayri, illustrates several important points. The mules, of course, as you see here, outperform ox-driven carts in mountainous landscapes despite smaller individual loads. But you can imagine that you can put more than one donkey carrying amphorae. Smaller, more flexible transport units allowed merchants to navigate rugged terrain efficiently. This explains the use of smaller amphorae and repackaging for localized trade. So trade, and this is where Dimitris comes into the game, and he explained all this beautifully, became decentralized, favoring frequent short-distance exchanges over bulk transport. In other words, logistical constraints shaped how goods moved, who could transport them, and where trade hubs developed. So the key takeaway of ABM, in this case, is that allowed us to simulate these transport scenarios beyond theoretical or bibliographical reasoning, unless if you want to build a cart and move the amphorae by yourself. So we can test now different transport strategies under realistic constraints. We can examine travel times, we can examine terrain difficulty, we can examine logistical efficiency. And if we had more time, we could also put obstacles, areas that are taboo, and so on, cemeteries, and vegetation, and so on. So we can also explore interactions between transport agents, routes, and seasonal or environmental variables. I think, and we discussed that with Hayri and Dimitris, this demonstrates that this dynamic simulation is not just a technical exercise. Okay, it's not another fancy tool, but it's a powerful tool for understanding movement, trade, and decision-making in antiquity. So it gives us a window to this kind of things. So from this second case study, we learned that terrain and transport method strongly influence, of course, trade efficiency, that smaller, adaptable transport units were likely the norm in mountainous regions, that ABM and 3D simulation can allow us to move from static maps to experiential scenario-based understanding. Like the Chimeria study I showed you before, this shows the potential, I think, of combining GIS, game engines, and ABM to answer questions that traditional archaeological methods alone cannot. Hence, I'm closing. What I have tried to show you today is just one possible method for reconstructing movement and perception in an ancient landscape. It's a method that can be effective and insightful, but is also a method that comes with limitations and uncertainties. Different parameters, technical, theoretical, and even interpretive, shape the success of such approaches, and as technology continues to evolve, some methods will inevitably become obsolete. However, the crucial point here lies not in the specific method itself, but in the promise of new digital tools and technologies to transform the way we think about the past. These innovations open up new possibilities, not only for landscape archaeology, but for the broader field of archaeology and archaeological thinking. We now have the ability, and will have even more so in the future, to simulate, to visualize, and to analyze past human behaviors in ways that were previously unimaginable. While this simulation may never give a definitive answer, and perhaps they shouldn't, given the complexity of human behavior, they do offer us valuable new horizons, inviting us to think differently to question assumptions, and to explore alternative scenarios about how people once moved through and experienced their landscape. It may not give us the exact number of hours it took for a wine-laden cart to reach the Temple of Kalapodi, or tell us precisely how quickly the people of Chimeria reached safety in their fort, but what these tools allow us is to theorize about such possibilities, starting from a solid, data-driven foundation, and that in itself is profoundly valuable. Although some might view all this as merely a technical exercise, at the center of it all stands the archaeologist, and I have to stress that. The person who in this new digital world must decide how to adapt, how to interpret, and how to apply these technologies. It is up to us to determine which of these magical, let's say, tools can be meaningfully tailored to serve archaeological questions. At their core, these tools are not about producing attractive visuals or flashy reconstructions, as some critics might claim. They represent, I think, a new way of thinking, a new mode of archaeological analysis, one that integrates data, theory, and simulation to deepen our understanding of the human past. So, recognizing and harnessing this potential is, I believe, the task and responsibility of our generation of archaeologists to bridge the gap between technology and interpretation and to ensure that these digital methods become tools for insight, not just for spectacles. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Vassilis, for this intriguing talk. I am always very happy to see common efforts to boost the reputation of the donkey. I think it is one of the most bad-mouthed animals in human history.
Yes, yeah.
But actually one of the most efficient. And because one always says the dog is man's best friend, but I think it's actually the donkey.
Yes.
In any case, there was a lot in the past 45 minutes, and I'm sure there are many questions. Tina, we have to speak into the microphone because for the online viewers.
Thank you. I will start with a thank you. That was very interesting, and I was particularly intrigued by the way you showed how to combine this method with questions,
Yes.
with real archaeological questions, because that was initially I was a bit skeptical, but you showed it very nicely. And I want to ask a very technical question. You mentioned several times that we or you or we are all limited by computational power. Have you explored the possibility, which I understand is new and I don't know anything about, so maybe you know, of renting cloud space for working on a server? Instead of
no, we do have a supercomputer in Athena. That's what it needs. Okay.
Yeah.
It needs something that can render the simulation. So all this you saw here is just, it's a work in progress, and hopefully we will establish methodology. So we now know the technical difficulties, because when we tried, and I will say it plainly as I can, when we tried to do the simulation for Kalapodi, the original idea is to do the whole central Greece, and then start, the movement from Antikyra and all that, and then the computer crashed. So we said, okay, we will go to the Lokris area. The computer crashed. So we will go to and then the computer again crashed. And because all these programs are also heavy. Okay, we had the same time open. This is also very technical. Unity 3D and GIS, QGIS, and all this stuff. So we now know what to use. Okay, yes, you can actually rent. I don't think it's a matter of cloud space. It's a matter of what kind of GeForce graphic cards you have, or how strong is your computational power. But now we know what to do. Okay,
yeah,
you cannot do it with your home computer. You can do this kind of small things like we did. Okay, and we don't exactly have home computers, but I did it with a gamer's laptop. Okay, so definitely you will need a good computational power.
Yes. My question was because apart from renting cloud for storage and supposedly now you can rent power.
Yes, probably.
So
Yeah.
you can work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
have explored
yeah,
this
no,
possibility.
no, we didn't explore that because we do have the machines.
Because you do have the
But
hardware. Okay.
yeah, it's a good observation. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Definitely, it's not out of our technical capabilities anymore. Okay. Yeah.
Well, that's the luxury of Athena research. Not everybody
Okay. No,
has
no,
that
no.
luxury.
I'm saying no. Not the luxury of Athena research. It's not out of anyone's technical capability because if you can actually rent this kind of space, you can do it by your
You
office.
have to opt you have to opt that option. And with you guys, you
Yeah,
have
we do have the
computational
machine, okay,
power
but yeah,
at home.
you can also drive from the house, or you can do you can adjust the simulation. Yeah.
Yes. Further questions, comments?
So yeah, thank you very much for the really exciting research you
Thank you,
presented
Diana.
tonight. It was really interesting. I was wondering, maybe as a next step, but maybe already you considered it. Have you made some efforts at looking at seasonalities?
Yes.
How the weather would affect, how the
Yes.
temperatures would affect.
Does
it change drastically?
Well, yes. Thank you for the question. These basically models they are open to all this kind of stuff. Okay. We just didn't have the time to do that. Okay, so I mean, this was our side project. Okay, let me. I will say it openly. Okay, and we adjusted our project with Dimitris or my personal interest to that. So, but yes, they are open to do whatever you want. You can put seasonal change. You can put, for instance, taboo areas that you will not cross from there because we know that there is an archaeologically manifested cemetery. You can put vegetation. Okay, I mean, for instance, Dimitris can tell us that in Kalapodi they have now data from pollen analysis about how was the vegetation there, so we can put it in the model. Okay, so all these things are open. Even you can. I don't have the video to show you, but all this started from real technical exercises. They did agent-based modeling in Athena in order to simulate how people move in case of fire. For instance, in this room, if a fire catches on, how quickly people will move to find the exit. And what I found really interesting is that they always have the fool, some agent that he doesn't know what to do. He's just banging on the wall because it's part of human behavior, panic attack or whatever. So all these are parameters that can go into the project as long as there is a project and someone will sit down and deal with it. And I'm very happy to say now we have new personnel coming with the project we have, and we have people that are experts in Unity, so we can actually move more. I mean, not to the amateur level I showed you here, but with a more professional level. But this is a good question. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the food for thought. Maybe too much food. It's going to be a very difficult thing to digest all this data.
Sorry.
But it's really excellent. And as I'm personally dealing with prehistory, this is even better. But here is the kind of double comment / question. Okay, about human agents, about, let's say, harbors and routes and everything. A very modern example and a very ancient maybe answer. So the modern example is, to my knowledge, at the island of Thira.
Yeah.
The modern-day harbor is entirely in the wrong place. Everything goes wrong. But primarily, it's there primarily, urban legend says, because the local mayor owns some of the property there.
Interesting. I didn't know.
Anyway, it's politics about using the specific harbor, which maybe makes no sense because it's the wrong spot. Now, the ancient answer is, I was intrigued by the old Assyrian colonies, the trade routes. And obviously, these guys had texts from 1800 BC. We don't in Aegean prehistory. So there are letters, actually. The old merchant says to the new merchant, try and go for the main route, pay the handsome fee, but you'll be safe.
Yeah.
But if you take the side road, which is more dangerous, it's fee less, but you will risk bandits, thieves, and the local king being very upset. So about human agent, the normal path would be the safe, longer route. The cheap one would be the dangerous one.
Yes.
Is there, as this is a growing field, if I understand, is there any possibility through comparative archaeology and with comparative texts? In my case, I want to do Mycenaean Greece, but maybe I will refer to the Assyrian colonies.
Yes.
Do you think that methodologically it will give us more explanations, more choices to choose why they've taken the weird route and not the old-fashioned route? if we combine this data from maybe you talked about Kalapodi in Roman Greece, but then you talked about Vintolada. So do you think this is a safe approach, or it has the risks of being different regions? So good luck with that.
Well,
Thank you.
Okay, I mean, strictly archaeological speaking, I would have told you, oh, well, we cannot compare different things. But, well, you test scenarios. This is the magic of this approach. So in these scenarios, you take real life conditions. And in this case, what you say, the real life conditions from Assyria to test it in Mycenaean Greece, and you can explain it archaeologically. Okay, you can say that, well, that we know that there were bandits, we know that there were roads infested with this kind of stuff, and I think it's quite feasible to do that. But it's a good pass their question, and I will come back to what Tina said before. So, in the core of all these simulations, there is someone, and this someone must be the archaeologists like yourself, like me, like Tina, like Will, like Dimitris and Valentina, that they set up the questions and they do the parameters. So it's up to you to explain sufficiently the examples you use and to prove if it's right or wrong. But it's open to magic and to fantasy and to do whatever you want. Okay, this is my opinion.
Well, if I just very shortly, Dimitri, just to add on that,
Yeah.
I think this, going to your point, these are discussions that also this, not necessarily has anything to do with agent-based modeling whatsoever. These are discussions that also, back in the day, people were already having with these cost paths. So, for example, you take tribal zones, for example, which you cannot really archaeologically really pinpoint exactly, precisely on a map. Impossible. But you can get more or less close, depending on which region, in which chronological period you're dealing with. And so basically just, technically, mathematically, so you have to come up with your cost surface model. You just add that as another cost factor.
Yes.
So, for example, and then you have that factored in. You were basing your models, or one of the many models that you were showing us today, but mostly on slope.
Yes.
And coming back to what Diana was saying, you can throw in all kinds of different other proxies, environment, seasonality, weather, whatever, but also those kinds of social factors if you have them. So, but you can also add merely an approximation. So for example, this region, very, very roughly, we know from Assyrian sources, for example, was deemed dangerous. So you bump up the cost.
Yes, exactly.
Within those pixels. For example, this is very technical now, but there you have it factored in, and you can experiment with that. Just an addition. But I think Dimitris wanted to.
Yeah, but before you say sorry, but imagine that the Will described with cost surfaces, that in Unity or in the agent-based modeling in Unity, you can do it with actual agents. Instead of actually adding up the cost surface, you can put actually units that they are bandits, Assyrian bandits or Mycenaean bandits or Thracian bandits, that they can actually impede the movement in this path. So you can actually adjust the scenario as you want. It depends on the data feed you have or whatever scenario you want to test.
But coming back to the original question, I think because it was more about what's the validity of comparing, let's say, non-similar situations, because you were talking about Assyrian sources and then somehow linking them into, let's say, the realities of Mycenaean Greece, or I don't know, my non-Mycenaean Greece. I guess it's a matter of you basically to decide. Whether the sources that you're going to be using are valid or not. You are the one who's actually, as Vassilis said earlier, that's going to be making the decision at the end of the day. And in our case, obviously, Kalapodi is far, far away from, Hadrian's Wall. But then again, we're talking about a time frame which is comparable, and then we're talking about a terrain which is also very much comparable. If you've been to Hadrian's Wall, and also we're talking about means of transportation that were in use at the time. We wouldn't have the same kind of carts, exactly the same type of cart as it was in use in northern Britain at the same time. But one would imagine that a similar kind of thing would have existed, let's say, in the area of.
Yes, but we know, for instance, however, that even in the Roman period, the traction technology was non-existent. So this, despite the general idea that the Romans were moving along the roads and they had this kind of happy circulation up and down, their wagons. They didn't have the traction technology that later, even in the medieval times, people developed. So they couldn't carry more than 500 kilos at the maximum. Okay, because then the carriage would have, couldn't go on the so
And that also on the road.
on a metal road, I mean, we don't speak about the dirt paths. So in this case, the Videolada tablet gave us a solid point of reference. Okay, yes, it was in England, but we know that actually it was the same context. They used these cards. Yeah, maybe it was not the same card, but it was something similar. Okay,
It was like the basic premise for calculating, the loading capacity and the carrying capacity basically of an ox-driven cart. But I mean, this is something that you can factor in, as Will said earlier, a number of things. I mean, you can even factor in ethnographic parallels if you want. If you think that they might be, helping you basically with your modeling, basically your simulation. So it's something that it's up to the researcher basically.
So basically, what this method needs is a dedicated team. Okay, not just 3 people. A team that will put ideas and to have to constantly, let's say, renegotiate your simulation and somehow to put new factors in. So yeah.
Those would have been very, very nice closing words, but I do have another comment, another question, if I may. Just what is it? Please indulge me. One last question. With all these things, agent-based modeling, these cost paths analysis, whatsoever.
Yeah.
So basically, just modeling past behaviors within space. I've always thought this to be entirely intriguing to use these methods. As back in the day, there was an old branch of these kinds of approaches coined predictive modeling.
Yes.
And I've always thought that this could be a very powerful tool in trying to enhance that model, because it is, at least I have the feeling, up until the 2010s, you were seeing a lot of scholarly publications, entitled something with predictive modeling, etc., and then it kind of faded away.
Yes.
And on the one hand, rightly so, because it is incredibly fuzzy.
Yeah.
But as an experiment, and this comes back to another point that you were raising, is to use these methodologies. This is something that I always say as well, and I totally agree, is to use these methodologies not necessarily really to publish anything.
Yeah.
But really to experiment.
Exactly.
And coming back to predictive modeling, so the one model with the long route from reaching up to Kadapodi, which is 17 hours.
Yeah.
If it takes you 17 hours, as you said, that was the calculation without rest, etc., etc. So you can perhaps use this model to really go out into the field and really use it as one did in the late 90s and early 2000s, really to go out and to ground truth, as one now says. And have you had any negative and or positive experience in that? Have you actually really gone out to the field and you see what our agent-based modeling takes the fool?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, is he going around, and have you tried to track the fool? Can you trace anything?
I haven't.
Just one example.
I haven't. But
the archaeological evidence.
It's a good idea actually to do that, to simulate this kind of
different
stuff.
scenarios and go out.
Yes.
If there's anything in the archaeological record.
Yes.
In the
well, this is why obviously I understand you do the Atlas lectures in order to have this kind of feedback. No, I didn't think about that, but it's actually very good. Yeah.
I've been thinking about this not only but your talk just brought back to the fore of my brain.
No, I'm.
For example, what comes to mind is that in Crete, at least, we have examples of sites, Bronze Age sites, where you have suspicions of remains. For 2 different kinds of routes. You have routes that would facilitate heavy loads. They didn't have donkeys, but we have to assume bovine of some sort. And you have the fast route.
Yes.
And in extreme situations where you have refugee sites or naturally fortified anyway sites, you can see that you have a zigzag road, which facilitates the animals, and you have a very fast and very steep. And there are remains usually in both, and you have to account for that somehow. Of course, it's not the Roman period; the roads are not as traceable, but.
Sure, but just to come back to the point, that you already have that in the archaeological record.
Well, you don't.
You have and you don't.
You have suspicion that you have.
You have suspicion. You have the suspicion that you might have it. But let's say just ideally, the model points something that the archaeological record has not yet ever, not only in any fantastical suspicion, has already as even indicated.
Listen,
that would just. But
I mean,
just
it's actually very good the comment. But the predictive modeling, as you said correctly, was very fashionable in the early 2000s and the rest. Then suddenly it disappeared because it was overnight was deemed deterministic and probabilistic, and they said
and non-successful
and not successful, and so they ended. Because I remember that there were a lot of GIS studies to predict this and that and this, but all these let's say obsolete approaches or the old technologies, they don't mean that they're not useful. You can readjust them now that you do have the methodologies, and so many people here today, or when they hear the YouTube lecture, they can actually find something and adjust methodology to their own needs and to find new questions like yourself. So this is what it is. It's an open methodology or a new method, or describe it as you want, but you take ideas, you adjust them in your archaeological questions. Okay, this is not Assassin's Creed. This is not a game that you build fancy 3D. This actually starts from a real archaeological question that we wanted to model how the dam pottery ended up in Kalapodi, or how the people experienced the landscape in Roman Thrace. So it starts from a solid archaeological question, and the guys are here today from the master's degree, and that's what I was telling them, that you should never forget that you are the archaeologist in charge, and you are setting the questions. Okay, and not the vice versa.
Sure. Again, Vassilis, fantastic closing words.
Thank you for the invitation.
If there are other very urgent comments or questions.
Thank you.
Well, anyways, before we send you off to the Christmas break, the Christmas tree is already here. We should probably announce the first lecture of the new year on January 12th, and you correct me if I'm mistaken, to be presented by Leonidas Vokotopoulos. To be presenting current research on the Minoan Road Survey Project. So, well, it's a bit premature to already wish you Merry Christmas, but in this context, we will not be seeing each other probably until the next year. But so, thank you very much for again attending, and see you all next year. And thank you again to Vassilis.
Thank you.